much. Okay. This is like being in court or something like that. Taking to the stand to tell the truth about fake news. I'm the only one who will tell you the truth about fake news. No one else will tell you the uncomfortable truth. Okay. So myself and Shane are to broadly talk about fake news versus fact-checking and a range of things like that. What I really wanted to talk about, in a way, is why the idea of fake news isn't all that helpful, or at least to talk a little bit about what is fake news and what is not, and to give some examples of it. Give a few frameworks maybe that we can then use for our discussion. So I speak for about 15 minutes or so, try to keep it to the point, and then we can move to, we have a nice discursive atmosphere here, so we can work with that. So why are people talking about this idea of fake news? It's clear that the internet changes and has changed profoundly the way in which news is made. And one of the things it's done, obviously, is it's opened up the field of news making significantly to a really wide diversity of actors. Now, that doesn't mean that existing power in terms of news production and the capital that's required and the concentration of resources that's required for media power, that doesn't mean that that doesn't exist anymore. But what it does mean is that the internet has opened up, it has lowered the costs of entry into news production. It has provided different kinds of hybrid models for news production, and it has provided space. It provides space, and space in which people can then circulate and disseminate their materials and their content at speed. So it has changed in a lot of ways the ways in which news is made, and also what counts as news in the first place. Now, that's the internet. If we add to that what we broadly call social media, or if we want to be more specific, these are internet-based networked communication platforms, right? That's what they do. This also impacts on how news is made, but it also impacts on how news is circulated, how news is consumed, how news is interpreted, and what people count as news in some ways in the first place. So everybody knows, I suppose, at this stage, that one of the things which is also quite significant in Ireland is the extent to which people now receive their news, or receive the majority of their news, through social media feeds, particularly through Facebook. And so what this means is that this is clearly happening at such a scale, it's such a profound change in some ways, it's clearly of public significance and political significance, that public conversations over the last year or two have really been about having kind of breathless about the impact of the internet, the impact of social media on news. So we have all of these concepts and ideas such as post-truth, or filter bubbles, or fake news, which try to say that in an era of networked, globalized media networks and media practices, this is resulting in serious problems. It's fracturing the public. It's introducing sources and information which are in many ways anathema to the public good, or that have political consequences, sometimes violent, and that we need to do something about that. And I agree. But I'm going to start by saying that I think the way to do that is not to accept the kind of sexy terms that the media itself proposes to think about what's going on with the media. So anytime we get a clamor, anytime we get lots of people talking about something being a problem, and particularly a problem that is caused by technology, but that can also be solved by technology, which is one of the ways the discussion is going, then we should be a little bit suspicious. Suspicious to the extent that we need to evaluate what is new and what is not, and what the impact is of what is new and how it relates to what went before. So let me give you some examples in introduction still, in terms of what I'm talking about. Let's take the idea, first of all, of post-truth, which is meant to be a product of, if you like, the infinite variety of sources which are available on the internet, and that one source always cancels out another. Well, last year, as many of you know, was the centenary of the 1916 Rising, and RTE had a series of debates about what the meaning of 1916 was, and I watched a lot of those debates. And in every single debate that I watched, the meaning of 1916, the significance of 1916, the legacy of 1916 was a subject of profound division. In other words, it wasn't just that people disagreed on what the Rising meant, they disagreed upon the facts themselves. We didn't call this post-truth because we know that when it comes to something like national histories, the facts are never settled and the facts are always interpreted through ideological and political lenses. Okay, so post-truth is not something which is simply caused by the internet. Secondly, newspapers in Europe have primarily developed in terms of what people who study newspapers call political parallelism, meaning that newspapers have historically had a relationship to a political party or to a political movement. Now that has changed quite significantly over the decades, particularly because of commercial competition. But if you think about it in Irish terms, for example, when we still had the Irish press, which is a history with the Fianna Fáil party, very few Irish press readers bought the Irish Independent, which is a relationship with Fine Gael, and vice versa. Very often you'll read the Irish Times and people will write to the newspaper's page and say, I used to be a proud Irish Times reader, but after you published this, I'm not an Irish Times reader anymore. Now, this is a filter bubble. This is people picking a newspaper and deliberately not picking another newspaper because of political allegiance, because of their identification with that newspaper, because of their political position. We never called that a filter bubble before. So yes, there are algorithmic reasons, the ways in which social media works, which prefer certain content to us over others, but we can't lose sight of the fact of political choice, ideology, all these other questions either. Finally, and moving towards the idea of fake news, if you go through the histories of very well-established brands, media brands, such as Channel 4, the New York Times, RTE in 2011 with their Primetime Investigates Mission to Prey scandal. Scandals about plagiarism, about fabrication of sources and material, of publishing unverified accusations and accounts. All of these are as much a part of the history of journalism as courageous story breaking or the everyday production of news. We didn't until recently call that fake news either. So it's a kind of a long introductory point, but the point I want to make in some ways is a simple one. When we say that something is exceptional, when something is unique, we lose sight of the ways in which we need to identify what is particularly unique about it, what is particularly new, and how we relate it to what went before in analysing what's at stake and in deciding how we might need to oppose something or work with something or work against it. The reason we're talking about fake news today and in general is very much because of the US presidential election and the obvious transnational impact, not just of American politics in general, but obviously of the election of Donald Trump. And in the aftermath of the US presidential election, which was a significant trauma also for mainstream liberal media in the United States, there was a particular emphasis on the way in which attack stories, now as we know in US political culture, attack ads, attack stories have long been part of the way in which political partisanship is organized during elections. But in particular in this election, very powerful online news sites such as Breitbart News, and everybody has been talking about Breitbart because until recently Steve Bannon was somebody who appeared to have power for a very short period of time in the White House and is a former editor of Breitbart News. And Breitbart is interesting because it's both, if you like, new media, it's online, and it is significantly networked and uses that network power in a variety of ways, but it's also old media in that there's a lot of money invested in it, and it uses that investment in ways that enhance its power. So Breitbart and others extended these attack stories on Hillary Clinton into including obviously fabricated stories, and obviously fabricated stories that came from a vast range of very densely linked right-wing or what became called alt-right sites, primarily at work in the US sort of media and political environment. And these stories were circulating intensively through linking in different sites, through social media sharing, and of course then through mainstream media coverage that would take up the story, cover it, and then attempt to rebut it, but obviously amplify the story at the same time. So what happened is that very quickly the idea of fake news became a headline issue. It became a way of talking about the way in which Hillary Clinton was attacked. But of course for the right wing, immediately what they did was they took the idea of fake news and they boomeranged it back and said, well, you accuse us of fake news, your news is fake as well because it's saturated in liberal bias. For some Democrats, who blamed Bernie Sanders for and blamed continuing divisions in the Democratic Party for Hillary Clinton not winning the election, they used the idea of fake news as a way of attacking progressive or alternative or, as they saw it, overly critical independent media sites. For some journalists who don't like the way in which social media makes their job more difficult in some ways, fake news was everything that is wrong with social media and everything that is wrong with the internet. And of course, fake news also became an ironic way of talking about anything. That's fake news, hashtag fake news, and so on. So what happened, in other words, is that the problem of fake news is not just that some news is faked, and when I talk about it, that's what I'm going to really talk about, deliberate manipulation aimed at deceiving people. But the idea of fake news allows us to say that any news can be delegitimated as fake. So in other words, because fake news now means anything from fabricated news to biased news to politically aligned news to unbalanced news to news that we think is too critical of those sources or causes or politicians that we align with, what happens is that the idea just doesn't really mean anything very much. And the reason for this is, of course, that fake news is an idea that's created by exactly the same media dynamics that it sets out to identify. Fake news is not just about news, it's about what's happening more generally in the whole information and media ecosystem. Fake news, or what we talk about as fake news, is one dimension of that, one symptom of that. But the problems, if you like, politically, and the problems when it comes to the circulation of hate speech and the legitimization of racism, which is what we're really here to talk about, that's something which I think is much deeper than simply the question of fake news. But to talk about fake news for a little while, at least to give us some frameworks to understand it, the reason we're talking about fake news is, or one of the ways in which we can talk about fake news, is to try to consider three things together. The first is the question of content. What different kinds of content are being created and being shared, and what kind of impact do we think they're having? The secondly is who is sharing them and why. What are the motivations of different kinds of actors? What kind of practices are involved with those who are creating fake news and circulating it, sometimes for fun, sometimes as part of a political project, sometimes as a deliberate attack on activists or politicians or individuals. And thirdly, the system. What are the ways in which the media system, both old and new media working together into something which is much more integrated, what is the way in which this disseminates and circulates content, and what kind of effect is it having? So, as I said, everybody is talking about fake news for the last couple of months, and one of the good results of that is that a couple of people have started to really question what the term means and try to define it or give us some ways of talking about it with more certainty. Brian McNair, for example, who's a well-established analyst of journalism, talks about fake news as being intentional disinformation. So basically his definition is very, very narrow. And it's very, very narrow because, much like the argument I'm making, he wants to keep it narrow so we can make connections to other kinds of dynamics and other kinds of processes. So he talks about fake news being intentional disinformation. That means that something is invented or something is falsified in relation to current issues or known facts. And this is done because it's motivated. It's motivated for political purposes or sometimes for professional purposes. And very often, as we'll see, for commercial or profit-oriented purposes as well. Now, so he deliberately narrows his definition down to this question of deliberate falsification and circulation that's motivated. It has a purpose. And I think that this is a very good way in which we can try to make sense or try to make this idea manageable for our discussions. Another analyst, Michelle Taylor, in a longer project for an organization called First Draft News, recently published a very helpful set of what she sees as kind of distinctions around what are the different kinds of content that people are talking about as fake news and how do they relate to each other. And so she gives what she sees as 7 different types of content that are circulating within this sort of hybrid media system of old and new media that she sees are labeled as fake news but have different dimensions to them. They do different things. So I'm going to go through them and give some examples. The first is, and this is an interesting one, is satire or parody. And this is interesting because, of course, what happens when something circulates on the internet is the context gets lost. Satire, humor, often has a very specific context. It can be a national context, it can be a subcultural context, it can be within a professional context. But when it circulates on the internet, it might, what is satirical can look to some people as being actual or real. So obviously satirical or parody isn't fake news, it's deliberately fake news, but it can have the consequence of being fake news. So think here about Waterford Whisperers, the Irish online satirical site, who had a story 2 years ago about a stampede in a branch of Lidl in Newbridge because the second checkout had been opened up and 30 people had been crushed. And this was picked up by the German Newsweek magazine Focus and reported as a real story, all right? And of course this happens because and this is where we start to see the links between different parts of the systems. Journalists who are often precariously employed, who need to write a certain amount of stories in the hope that they will be picked up or need to fill a certain amount of online content, are constantly looking for things to write about. And therefore, both in journalistic practice, things can creep through that aren't properly checked, but also for big sites which are about attracting clicks and views as part of their very business model, content is circulated without ever being checked, because that's what's called the revenue window. That is how if you don't publish it, somebody else will, and therefore it's a system which is, if you like, set up to ensure that people can't step back from that commercial imperative because somebody else will pick it up. And therefore, if you like, it's systemic. It just happens in this way. So that's the first content category, satire or parody. The second one is what she calls misleading content. So now we're kind of getting closer to Brian McNair's idea of fake news as being fabricated, deliberately misleading. This is often, you notice this also happens as part of kind of general internet dynamics. But it's happening a lot recently around arguments about what's happening in Syria. So old news stories, for example, are recirculated as if they're contemporary news stories. And what happens is, because of the way news stories show up on Facebook, what you get is a banner image which gives you the headline and which gives you the headline image, but you don't necessarily get the date or any other kind of contextual information. So these just keep circulating, and they become part, if you like, of mystifying the debate or mystifying the analysis. So that's the second category, misleading content. The third one, and here we get much closer now to putting real effort, real labor into misleading people, is what she calls impostor content. And this is where people attempt to impersonate real sources. You'll see this online, for example, if you mistype the name of The Guardian, or if you mistype the name of an established mainstream news site. There's lots of news sites which are, if you like, impersonating them. They use the same sort of online design. They obviously have a different web address. They change slightly the spelling, and they hope to put that into circulation. They hope that people will pick this up as a real story, or again, just simply creating fog. The fourth one, fabricated content. So this is probably, if you like, the most pure definition of fake news. That is false and designed to deceive people, designed to make false connections between events, designed to have actual impact, political impact, real impact in the world. And this is, of course, very close to what people call clickbait, which is simply that people produce lots and lots of stories which are true, partly true, or not true at all, maybe amusing, maybe sensational, maybe disgusting, in the hope that people will click through and therefore generate revenue. But also, when we look at sort of anti-immigration activism, for example, this is something that's highly developed around the production of migration statistics. Lots of sites out there that look like institutes. They look as if they have real research and institutional weight behind them, but what they have is a very nice fancy website. And what they're doing is they're circulating misleading information, misleading statistics that looks like knowledge and that enters in, if you like, to the informational ecosystem as knowledge. This has been likened before to the idea of money laundering. You know, if you have illegitimate money, you invest it in something, and then you spend the profit and you've laundered the money. This is information laundering. Right? In other words, you make sure that this passes through enough legitimate looking fronts that it turns up on Google searches and becomes part of the public debate. So that's fabricated content. False content is her fifth, false content is the fifth category that she talks about, which is, and this is an interesting one because I think this is the most prevalent one, which is that it's genuine information, but it's shared with a deliberately misleading context. So in other words, it's not 100% false, it's not a deliberate lie, it has a relationship to something which is going on, but the context and the way in which it is framed is deeply mendacious, deliberately misleading, and often with a very, very clear sort of racist agenda behind it. You'll see this quite a lot, for example, in those websites and online news sites that are called the Islamophobia industry, that basically spend a lot of time looking at, and this is again why the idea of filter bubbles doesn't make a lot of sense, a lot of these groups spend a lot of time combing the BBC, combing CNN, and any story they can find anywhere in the world about Muslims or Muslim-looking people, they reframe it. So if you like, there's a grain of truth to the story in there somewhere, but it's reframed and circulated and becomes part of proving why they're a problem and why they need to be kicked out of the country and so forth. But again, to make the point, this is not just something which is created by the internet. There's a strong imperative in newspapers at the moment to publish very inflammatory comment pieces as a way of generating attention, as a way of upping sales, as a way of generating online attention. So take yesterday, for example, in the Sunday Times, Kevin Myers was writing about the Dublin City Council motion to fly the Palestinian flag above Dublin City Council as a gesture of solidarity, and he used this motion, which is before Dublin City Council, to suggest that Dublin City Council was in charge of or had taken control of Irish foreign policy, and in essence to suggest that Dublin City Council is a nest of anti-Semitism. Okay? So that's something which is an established form of sensationalist, ideologically motivated journalism. It does exactly the same thing. It provides false context. So it's not just, again, a question of internet dynamics. Finally, is what Taylor calls manipulated content. And this is obviously where we get into very, very tricky areas, and I'm sure where Shane has a lot to say in terms of, for example, the circulation of images. We saw this a lot during the intensification of the refugee and borders crisis in the summer of 2015, that images that were taken from all over the internet were circulated as images from Macedonia, or images from the Hungarian border, or images from the Mediterranean. And what these tended to do is they tended to take photos, big group-like photos, almost exclusively of brown-skinned or black-skinned men, to suggest that this was part of a takeover of Europe. And these images were circulated, of course, again, in the ways that I'm talking about, constantly reproduced as an image from the border or from the front line or whatever it might be. And I think this is also somewhere where there's, I think one of the things we need to understand is people put a lot of effort into. We tend to think of online trolling as sort of a weird hobby. Why on earth would people do it? But a lot of people put a lot of effort and a lot of time and a lot of expertise into introducing these kinds of this kind of noise and this kind of disturbance into the informational ecosystem. And what that means is, of course, that what happens, and this is one of the problems with the fake news era, is that nothing can then be trusted. So when the image of Alan Kurdi, if you remember, the toddler who washed up after drowning along with most of his family, and his body washed up on the beach in Bodrum in Turkey in September 2015, Breitbart News, along with a lot of other right-wing sites, spent a long time studying that photo and annotating it and circulating it and saying, well, if this boy drowned at sea, his body would be more bloated. There's no way that his body would be lying in this angle so photogenically and so angelically and suggestive of a toddler at sleep. His body would be much more bloated. His body would be much more destroyed. So in other words, the kind of things that we associate with critical literacy, questioning images, have also become a kind of reactionary tool. They've also become a way of saying, well, obviously this photo is being circulated by the CIA because they want more Muslims to come into Europe and so forth, right? So all of these things then enter very much and very quickly into conspiratorial thinking. So why then does this kind of content circulate? This is the third part of Taylor's framework. The arguments, or the reasons she gives, I think, are very well known to us at this point. The first is poor journalism, or what she calls poor journalism. I think it's also something to do with the economy of journalism, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on in our discussion. I don't want to take on everything here in this one talk. The second is what she calls provocation, or punking, or trolling, as we generally call it, which is that this is something that people see as part of the fun of living in a networked environment. It encourages a particular kind of dark humor, a particular sense of consequencelessness for one's actions, and therefore why not do it? It's just a click away. Partisanship, political alignment, which is something which I think the US, in terms of the US election, has sent a sort of shockwave through journalism in general, which has been very used to thinking of itself as a kind of in a helicopter above society, just reminding people of the rules of the game, and that if we report objectively and if we give balanced coverage, then society will sort itself out. But one of the things we can see happening, particularly with right-wing media and the kind of network power that it accumulates, is that they are very obviously politically aligned. They're very obviously deliberately saying, this is where we stand, this is what we think, come and get us. And you can see that happening now everywhere in a way that is becoming, in some ways, a kind of, not a crisis, let's say, but a mini crisis for journalism. Recently in Germany, the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, have banned the German public service broadcaster, and they've banned the biggest German newspapers from attending any of their press conferences, which is a problem for journalists. You need to cover what these parties are saying, but what they're saying is, until your coverage of us gets more favourable, your part of the elite, you're part of the problem, and you're not coming to our press conferences. So again, false news, we need to link into these bigger changes in the informational system and media system and the political system. And of course, profit is the last example which she gives, which I've talked about in relation to clickbait and so on. How long more, Dorothy?
Maybe if you wrap up in the next 5 minutes.
Perfect, that's grand. Okay, how I want to wrap up is to look at one example of where these different types of content that Taylor distinguishes as being, some are more false news than others, but all of them create, if you like, a very particular partisan informational environment, which is very favorable to the circulation of racist rumor mongering, gossip, images, and so forth. And I'll take one example that I did a little bit of research on recently, which was after Donald Trump's speech on February 18th in Florida, where he was talking about his Muslim ban. And he said, look, we've got to keep our country safe. Look at what's been happening in Germany. Look at what happened in Sweden last night. Sweden, who would believe this could happen in Sweden, right? Now, of course, one of the things that Trump has done very well with his speeches and with his tweeting is that he understands very well the economy of labor, the economy of digital labor, which is, I say something outrageous and you will have to put 4 people on real time to fact check that in order to correct it for your public. And while you've done it, I've already moved on and it has no consequences for me. But vampire-like, I've sucked your labor out of you. And that's really one of the structural problems with something like false news or rumor mongering, that it takes nothing to produce it. But if you are an institution or an NGO or a government department that is, say, for example, committed to having accurate statistics on migration, you have to put a huge amount of labor into counteracting what is very, very, very difficult to counteract. So this is the kind of logic that Trump has politically integrated into his apparently sort of random late night tweets as he sits around in his dressing gown all lonely and angry, or whatever it is that he does. So this is fact checked. There's no incident in Sweden. One of the things, of course, that people did point out is actually, yes, things have been happening in Sweden. There are regular, for example, arson attacks or physical attacks on asylum seeker shelters. But there was no attack which would prove or seem to prove Trump's thesis about Sweden being dangerous and therefore we need to have a Muslim ban in the US. So Trump tweeted a clarification 2 nights later where he said he was referring to a program on Fox News, which was an interview on the Tucker Carlson show, which some of you may know, which is a very sort of quintessential Fox News sort of attack program where somebody is brought on either to be agreed with or to be destroyed. And that this was an interview with a filmmaker or documentary filmmaker called Amy Horowitz, who had made a documentary for Breitbart on how Sweden had become the rape capital of Europe and how there were Muslim no-go areas in Malmö and in Stockholm and so forth. And he made this documentary for Breitbart, even if Breitbart and Fox News are apparently in tension with each other over who gets to be the top dog in relation to the Trump presidency. So what do we have so far then in this picture? The first thing we have is a transnationally circulated claim. Trump says it, people report it, people fact check it, and lots of people go online to say, well, actually Sweden is really like this. Here's some evidence from YouTube, here's some evidence from something else. It becomes generative. People start to circulate the myths, people start to circulate the idea that Sweden, because of its lax immigration policy, is particularly dangerous, but nobody will talk about it because everybody is too tolerant, and therefore my fake news is the only really truthful news because the elite won't talk about what's really happening. This is produced through repetition and suggestion. It simply moves constantly through social media networks. People keep taking these, for example, these little YouTube videos, or keep taking these sort of false news stories about Sweden, integrating them into comment threads. People click on them, they get integrated. We know how this works. We all experience it. So then media, just look at what I'm looking at here. Then these ideas, of course, are backed up in a sort of milieu that underlies Breitbart and all of these other kinds of reasonably successful, powerful right-wing players in the sort of right-wing media ecosystem, which is that there's endless blog sites, there's endless Facebook pages which are dedicated to this kind of rumor mongering and which have a long history of saying, well, yeah, Sweden or Norway or these countries which look to be sort of paradise, social welfare paradises, which look to be the sort of modern, quintessential, progressive, liberal European state, and look at the problems that they have. So it plays into an existing structure which is already there and circulates on the basis of that. It already feels true because people want it to feel true. And then what happens, of course, is that it gets picked up, it gets reported, it gets commented on, and it gets an extra lease of life as well. So it circulates from the political to the mainstream, in and through the internet, back to the mainstream, and so forth. So, just let me see, where did I put my last set of notes? Ah, yeah. Okay. So these are the kinds of dynamics that we get in this kind of story. There's a long history, if we were to talk about the political right wing, or the kind of racist right wing in Europe and the US, there's a long history of people setting up research groups, front sites, institutes that circulate these kinds of ideas. What's happened under these kinds of circumstances is they've got more network power. Their ideas, their resources, their images circulate in all of these ways that we've been talking about. And this is where social media becomes absolutely crucial, because social media allows for this material to circulate in ways which are very, very difficult to confront, and which is why so much of the discussion about fixing hate speech seems to rely very much either on some form of legal fix. So Germany announced last week, I think it was, that they were going to bring in legislation forcing social media providers to remove fake news, which is very, very difficult to do, but we can talk about that afterwards. Or trusting in large companies to act in a sort of large private companies to act in a public spirited fashion. And this is another part of our problem, which is that social media platforms are commercially driven private platforms, but they act these days as a public infrastructure. We all use them for good and for bad. And therefore to expect private interests to act in the public good is a very, very, very difficult thing to deliver indeed. Primarily, of course, because so much of this does come down to the question of the sort of algorithmic structure and the structure of how Facebook or how Twitter works, but particularly Facebook, because Facebook's structures reward content that has been engaged with. It's more likely to surface when it is engaged with. Therefore, the more that this is circulated and the more that it is integrated, the more likely it is to pop up, and so forth. And this is very much the same for material that comes from websites which are constantly producing news in the hope that that news will be picked up and shared on social media, or picked up and paid for somehow by some other kind of news provider, which is that they're simply running this kind of content without checking it, without having any kind of editorial control over it. So the point I'm trying to make here is that something like Trump's idea about Sweden already has, if you like, lots of resources which were ready to be what's the word I'm looking for, re-enervated by his speech, but they also circulate in ways that are systemic. It's very, very hard, if you like, to think about ways in which we can confront it. But I want to finish with one point as well, and that is to talk not just about the media here, but to talk about politics. The interesting thing about the Sweden example is, of course, that lots of journalists then went to interview Swedish politicians or people in Sweden to say, well, you know, isn't this terrible? Trump is holding us up as an example of everything that's terrible. And our society, while it's not perfect, has, of course, many good things going for it, which is, of course, true. But in Swedish politics, the same kind of discourse exists about areas of Malmo or areas of Stockholm, that there are too many immigrants there. And as we know, if you've got too many immigrants there together, it looks like a ghetto, it looks like a no-go zone. And for decades, politicians in Sweden and elsewhere have been pointing to these kinds of areas and saying, look, this shows us the problem with immigration. This shows us the problem with uncontrolled multiculturalism. So it is, I think, in a conference like this, we always have to recall the fact that one of the reasons that something like fake news works so well in racist terms is because the work of pointing out certain populations as a problem has already been done politically, and not just by the right wing, it's already been done by the political mainstream. And therefore, it isn't just that there's an informational infrastructure through which this kind of material circulates successfully. There's also a political and ideological infrastructure, which means that people are predisposed to share it, predisposed to feel feel that it's legitimate to believe it, and predisposed to believe that it's legitimate to act on it because it has already been sanctioned in many ways by the mainstream. So it's a mistake, I think, in my view, to use ideas such as fake news, which seem to suggest that all of the problems are online and all of the problems exist in social media, and if we could somehow deal with all of those problems out there, then we would deal with these problems politically. The specific things we need to deal with in relation to social media platforms and the internet, but the bigger issue of how hate speech is generated has got a lot to do with the way in which racism functions politically in society. So thanks.